Welcome to another series of comparative world literature, lectures on comparative world literature. In fact, in the 20th century, we are facing a kind of globalized literature that aims to obliterate localized ecological pockets and other social pockets, suggesting a mono-globalized language that systematically tries to assert an anthropocentric world characterized by distorted planetary health. So we are in another phase of discussing more and more on comparative literature. I welcome our most honored, most revered Vice Chancellor, ma'am, and we can organize this such a massive discussion on comparative literature because of her, and it is solely it's her initiative, and she has organized much more lecture series previously took place, and today we are in another phase of lecture series on comparative world literature. I just welcome ma'am to uh, give an inaugural speech on this, and welcome our guest.
Well, thank you, Priyanka. I congratulate you for being the convener of many of the lectures of this particular lecture series, and welcome Professor Ajanta and Professor Jaydeep Sarangi on behalf of Hindi University, the entire faculty and staff and students, research scholars, and other staff members, the registrar, the finance officer, the controller of examinations, on behalf of everybody. I welcome both of you as our eminent speakers in this very important lecture series on comparative world literatures that we have introduced in January. Before Priyanka gets into introducing both of you formally, I would take the liberty and I would take the opportunity of talking a little bit about my association with both the eminent speakers today for the record of my colleagues. So, dear colleagues, yeah, I have long and very deep association and connection and friendship with both the eminent speakers today. Today, I will go one by one. Professor Ajanta Paul is quite a big name. She has been writing, she has been a creative writer and a critique of repute since decades. As far as I know her, I have always seen her very active as the head of an institution. Now she is doing amazing work, and I got to know Professor Ajanta Paul more than 10 years ago through a common friend who introduced her to me to be one of the course material, a member of the course material preparation team for IGNO. When I was a professor and director in IGNO, Professor Ajanta Paul substantially contributed to our MA English program through a couple of courses that I designed: American poetry and American drama. During that period, I saw the complete professionalism and also commitment of Professor Ajanta Paul. She was already a senior professor at that time, but she was the first one to write and submit the chapters, 10,000 words each chapter, with zero plagiarism, with extremely good research, and with complete commitment and within the time frame. So that is where I was highly impressed with the professor. I thought that the professor should be like this. No matter how busy we are, how engaged we are, if we take up an assignment, then we have to complete it. Otherwise, we need not take those assignments. And she is one of those people who is committed to the trade, to her business. So I have highest respect for Professor Ajanta Paul. Now, coming to my personal association with Professor Ajanta Paul, I also take the liberty of calling her, addressing her as Ajanta Di. She is a very compassionate, kind, and a very loving and an affectionate personality. When I reached Calcutta last month as the Vice Chancellor of Hindi University, she was one of among the first few people who sent me a message that, Nandini, we are so glad that you are in Calcutta. I would invite you over a cup of tea. And then I met her in Calcutta, and we spent more than 2 hours together. We were talking literature, we were talking poetry, we were discussing about life, and she was so affectionate with me. I felt at home in Calcutta, maybe because a person like her. So, with complete gratitude, lot of respect, and lot of love and affection for Professor Ajanta Paul. I invite her to be a part of the Hindi University lecture series. Of course, Dr. Priyanka Guha will introduce her formally. Her work will be discussed today. Now, coming to Professor Jaydeep Sarangi, whenever I talk to him, it's like homecoming. We have been poets writing more than for 2 decades. We have been writing for similar journals and books. Very often, I find that our poetry is published together in many journals and many books, e-magazines. And Dr. Jaydeep Sarangi has been known all over Indian academia as a good poet, a committed poet, and is a friend to all. Many people appreciate him, admire him for his friendly nature, for a charming smile that he always has on his face. And he is a good scholar of Australian literature, as far as I know, indigenous Australian literature and Dalit writings. He has done a lot of work on Dalit literature. Of course, Dr. Priyanka will introduce him formally. In 2014, I had been to a university in Calcutta. That is when I met Dr. Jaydeep Sarangi. He invited me for the supper in the evening. He said, I invite you for supper. So we spent some good time in a restaurant in Calcutta in the year 2014. After that, we haven't met physically, but yes, virtually we have met on several occasions. He is just like a brother to me, and apart from being a good scholar, a fellow poet, and a brother, he is a very kind and a very nice and a very sweet human being. And thank you very much, Dr. Joydeep Sarangi, for being what you are, for being a friend to all, such a kind-hearted person, and of course for having accepted our invitation to be a part of Hindi University Special Lecture Series. Now, coming to the lecture series, I will just inform you a little bit about the series. I joined uh, Hindi University, which is a language university, on 20th of December last year, which is just 2 months from now, probably. And then I had multiple meetings with my faculty members, including Dr. Priyanka, and many of them, and they came up with ideas. I said, you be flexible, give me your ideas and your suggestions. So everyone had some or other idea. I have taken the points, the suggestions, the ideas from all my colleagues, and that is when I envisaged that we should have a new department, a very important department, comparative world literatures department. Please understand that nowhere in the country, no other university in the country has a department titled Comparative World Literatures. They have comparative literature departments where they deal with various Indian languages. They have schools of or departments of foreign languages where they deal with foreign languages. But here we are, Hindi University, a very unique university which was designed by the government of West Bengal, keeping in view the needs of the languages in the world. We have proposed this department, Comparative World Literatures Department, where we are planning to design nothing less than 30 MA programs on the 22 Indian languages and on folk literature, on tribal literature, and many foreign languages, which we will be doing in very near future. But before we get into designing the MA programs, I thought that we can have a lecture series. So we will hold our lecture series in the physical mode once we shift to our new campus in the new town. But now we are functioning from the old campus. So we thought that we should have a lecture series online. So this webinar series started in January, and I think already 12 or 13 people, eminent scholars, the best brains in the country have already spoken for Hindi University, and we have recorded everything. If you go to World Wide Web, to Google, and then you type Hindi University Lecture Series YouTube, you will find many YouTubes, and please feel free to listen to those YouTube lectures by eminent scholars and kindly circulate those lectures among your students. Please ensure that the students get to understand what is comparative world literature. Three very different words: comparative, world, and literatures. Three very different words, and we have tried to put all of them together. And we are trying to create a pedagogy. We are trying to create a platform so that tomorrow, when we propose our department and design those 30 MA programs, we will be in a position to use the lectures delivered by all of you. And yes, we have invited the best brains in the country, in the world, to be a part of our lecture series. And we consider both of you to be the best brains in the country. So, welcome once again to the Comparative World Lecture World Literature's lecture series by Hindi University. And now I suggest that Dr. Priyanka should introduce both the speakers formally and then invite both of them, after which we can go to the lectures. I request both the speakers to take 25 to 30 minutes each to speak so that we will have some time to discuss. Thanks once again. Welcome.
Thank you, ma'am. First, as Jaydeep sir was saying that he's having a viva, so I just introduce Jaydeep sir first.
Please,
Dubbed
please.
as a bird on the banks of Dulu, Jaydeep Sarangi is an Indian poet, poetry activist with 11 poetry collections in English, latest being the Half Confession 2024, and scholar on Dalit studies, post-colonial studies, and Indian writings with 41 books anchored in Kolkata, Jhargram. Widely anthologized and reviewed as a significant contemporary poet, Sarangi is on the editorial boards for journals of repute devoted to marginal studies and poetry criticism. With Rock Hurl, he has edited 6 anthologies of poems from Australia and India, which are a wealthy literary link between the nations. With Amelia Walker, he has guest edited a special issue for Text Australia. Sarangi has 20 books and several articles, essays, reviews on Dalit studies, which are an window to the world. His recent article, The Sociological Self as Palimpsest, uh, Caste, Class, Religion, and Gender in the Select Writings of Burma, appeared through Routledge, UK. His recent books include Mapping the Mind, Minding the Map, 20 Contemporary Indian English Poets, Sahitya Academy 2023, and A Life Uprooted, a Bengali Dalit refugee remembers by Sahitya Academy 2023. Mapping the Mind, Minding the Map. Again, it is it's okay. The 2023 Sahitya Academy is the latest book. Sarangi is currently the president of Guild of Indian English Writers, Editors and Critics and vice president, EC Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library, Kolkata. He's an EC member of Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library, Kolkata. Living with Poets and Poetry, Sarangi is principal of New Alipur College, Kolkata. Uh, we welcome you, sir, to this special lecture series. Ma'am, shall I continue with the biodata of Ajanta ma'am as well, or shall we?
Maybe, yes, you can talk about her biodata as well, after which they can speak.
Just
Thank you, Priyanka ma'am. It's an honor and privilege to speak in this platform. And as your Honorable Vice Chancellor has already introduced both the authors and our links in the academia. And about another thing is that we had a very close association with your Vice Chancellor's, Honorable Vice Chancellor's guide, research guide, Dr. Niranjan Mahanti. And Professor Niranjan Mahanti treated me like his own son. And for nearly 2 decades, we follow each other, and it's a mutual journey of growth and development together. I honor it as my part of my making. Thank you, Dr. Nandini Sahu. She knows no introduction as a name by her own words. Thank you, Nandini Madam. And continue all these efforts, and we are all there for whenever you need us. That is, we are on the kind of, I think, a phone call away. Okay, a text away. I'm really pleased to speak on the platform where Ajanta is also part of the co-panel, because Ajanta is also an inspiration, as Nandini Madam has already uh, introduced her. She is a close associate of mine and my making for a long, long time. She has been very productive, active, and a soul maker. I will quote unquote, a soul maker, Ajanta. Thank you so much for your love, affection, and our mutual journey together. The topic that I am going to discuss today as Lives Matter through contemporary Indian English eco-poetry. No, this is a huge aspect, but I will, no, in 25 minutes time, I will concentrate only on a theoretical parameter and to
No, no,
the
Sarangi, please take 30 minutes. Don't worry.
30 minutes. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so in 30 minutes time, I'll concentrate only on the northeastern part because the time is so limited and we will have to encompass a big thing. Before coming into the introductory part of my talk, I always claim, and it has been published worldwide, that possibly Indian English poetry is going through its happiest and the most fertile time because all the poets writing in English have in their baggage a long history of the language. That means 2, 3 generations of English. And Indian English poetry has been democratized all over India. And when we talk of Indian English poetry, we also keep in mind Indian diasporic poetry abroad, may it be in Europe, America, Latin America, Australia, and other parts of the country. So it is possibly the destination of Indian English poetry. And now everybody talks about Indian English poetry. But before Indian independence, no one could write a good, solid poem on Indian freedom struggle by an Indian. But from hesitation, from uncertainty to maturity, growth, confidence, acceptance, appropriation, and celebration, this journey took place in over a period of nearly 200 years. We are in 2025 and go back, and possibly in 2029, the first book of collection came out by an Indian, out and out an Indian, Kashi Prasad Ghosh, who was a Bengali. So almost 195 years of development of Indian English poetry. I deliberately didn't mention Derozio because of his mixed parentage, but of course, Derozio was the first person to introduce Indian English poetry, something called Indian English poetry that he wrote in just a couple of years before Kashi Prasad Ghosh. But from the Gangotri, the Ganga emerged, and that Ganga is flooding the world. The first half of my title is Lives Matter. Because in eco poetry or environmental poetry, green poetry, I'm talking about poetry, it can be literature or literary movement. It is a topical, literary, political, and social movement in all art forms. By all art forms, I mean, may it be in painting, may it be in dance form, may it be in protest, in different shorts. And these lives matter is a it connects one into another, one living force to another living force, one epi living force to another epi living force. It highlights a living ecosystem for encompassing eco-friendliness and empathy building among all living creatures on this earth. And it also promotes the harmony and coexistence among nature and man. But not not a nature and man as in the Wordsworthian sense. Its primary concerns are police brutality and motivated violence against our mother earth and its ecosystem. Eco poetry thus contributes to the dissident project of resistance to dominant cultural models of thinking that are about the linear progress of humanity. We always think that progress of humanity means tall skyscraping buildings, sky-kissing buildings, and destructions of forest and making a township or connecting routes, rail, road, and other ways. With a set of cultural tools, it navigates how the human is situated within its habitat, how home is defined, and how the home is built, where borders exist between body and the world, human and the other, space and place, and how sense activates physical presences, memory, moments of thinking locate and assist the human desire to navigate the self in the world. Humans over nature is critiqued for its epistemological fallacy. And that fallacy is to account for its contribution to the current ecological crisis worldwide. For nature, the concept of nature is no longer the rustic retreat of the Wordsworthian saints. It is now a pressing political question, a question of survival in this world. Very different from the nature poetry. Eco poetry explores the complicated connections between people and his ecology, often written by the poets who are concerned about our impact on the natural world of flora and fauna. All epigenetic influences on man and his mind come through the ecosystem where the poet lives in. Poets today are serving as witness to climate change while bringing attention to important environmental concerns and advocating for preservation of biodiversity and conservation of the earth and its ecology. In this morning, I am privileged to speak on a platform with two other very prominent eco poets. One is Professor Nandini Sahu, and of course, Professor Ajanta. Today, I will concentrate only on the northeastern part of India, and I will deliberately speak about three very prominent voices which engages to eco-poetics. The first name is, of course, well known to all of us, is Mamangdai. If you go, my interview is available with Mamangdai on internet, a detailed interview and how she writes, and why she writes, and all that. In the interview, Mamang says, I am tribal, and the geography, landscape, our myths, stories, all this has shaped my thoughts, as quote unquote. The native of the northeastern region and a sensitive individual, Mamangdai, she has explored, discovered, and presented the land and the people in a linguistic framework for the readers of the world. As an as a writer, her experience led her to have inner urges to delve deep into the folk tales or the oral stories of the place. And Mamang says, I have learned a lot traveling through different parts of the state from talking with Miri and shaman healers and mythology, spiritual belief, all are a part of my interest for me. I am particularly influenced by our oral narratives dealing with creation or myths. Maman continues, this is like an archaic, intricate, sparkling, epic experience that make me a poet. If we put her poems into the genre of Inco poetry, it will be very pertinent for all of us to situate her poetry in the present context of eco poetry. The poetry that she writes is replete with all the nuances of the environment and ecology which have been associated when we call something called eco poetry. The term eco poetry has come into currency recently and has been recognized as a subgenre of poetry. And the poetry has already touched into nature's paradigm and how Mamangdai believes that the concept of the natural phenomena and all its subsidiary entities are very active agents performing in life sustaining role in the humankind making. For Mamangdai, writing is a process of transference and it transfers all her inherent knowledge of the mountains, rivers, clouds, trees, and other natural parameters into her eco poetry. During her career as a journalist, she felt the inner inkling to write creatively about the region where she is from and about the regional myths surrounding of sustenance of the nature. As she writes, I wanted to write about life in the bowl of the hills and record all the hidden histories, the beautiful landscape and way of life, even if only for myself. Hills and mountains leave important measures and sensuous perceptions to a sensitive soul of the poet, and she engraves beautifully and lexicalized images for her creative output. Her poetic endeavor, one title is, of course, we can refer to The Voice of the Mountain. The voice of the mountain portrays the persona of the mountain who speaks as a living being, witnessing the long history of the natives of the land. The celebration of the natives of the land, the cultures of the place are very important facets of Mamangdai's works. The poet's imaginative faculties do not let her consider mountain as a non-living entity, rather as a living body who watches from the highest peak the journey of the ferries crossing the river and the climbers of the mountain. Fairies symbolize and represent the journey of human race from the birth to death in the lap of the water. Water bodies are very prominent in Mamangai's works. Waterless life is non-conceivable. The first person pronoun I stands for the soul of the mountain, outliving everything, everyone from everywhere. The mountain, as an intelligent observer, the seer, knows the history of the land and it can describe the various episodes of the world, quote unquote. We can go on about referring to Mamangdai and contextualizing her, how important she is in the map making of eco poetry from the contemporary India. Next person I would take up, the person is no more, but her contribution is enormous. Tamsula Ao. Tamsula Ao is an ethnographer. She worked on the oral tradition of her own Ao Naga community. Her contribution is very prolific and extraordinary in the field of environment literature. She voices not only for the cultural transformation, but also for the environmental degradation in the northeastern region. By virtue of a professor, she learned a lot about theoretical practices and applied them possibly into her writing. Temshula Ao sings of her landscape, and that is often been objective, correlative for her mindscape, and of course, even more for the community's ecology. I think this is very important when someone is not writing for herself, but writing for her own community's ecology. That in that context, in some of the very prolific writings from the marginal communities writing poetry these days, we find that they are not writing for one personal thing, but they are writing for the community, and that is very prolific. The changes in the land reflect the damage done to her people, their rootlessness, a sense of rootedness, on uprootedness as well. Their wounds, their pains, all are very important part of Temsula's poetry, and how people are uprooted even in their own community roots. That is a centrality that constitutes the centrality of our poetry. House poetry is marked by a deep understanding of eco-consciousness, and therefore they can be analyzed from eco-sensitive point of view. In this particular talk, I would refer to some of her poems. For example, look at the titles of some of her very important poems. Lament for an Art, Blessings, Earthquake, The Garden, Bonsai, My Hills, A Strange Place, Prayer of a Monolith. And all these titles are very important if we talk consciously and how we talk about green literature today, green movement today, or eco literature today. Look at Temshula Ao's poem, Lament for an Art, which was a part of Songs That Tell, 45 to 47 page. It reveals her lamentation over the miserable condition of our planet as a result of urbanization, modernization, and in the name of industrialization. Temshula here represents nature as a living organism by using personification and feminine form. She laments for the earth where once upon a time there was a verdant virgin, vibrant as well, and all forests were vibrant and virgin, and which is full of tall trees and provided cool shades to the birds and the animals. She says now, once upon a time, once on this earth, there was a forest, verdant, virgin, vibrant, with all tall trees in majestic splendor, their canopy unpenetrated even by the mighty sun, the stillness humming with the birds' cries. While on one land, by using the phrase once upon an earth, how creates a fairy tale like effect to portray a picture of the primitive art in the reader's mind. On the other hand, by using the word virgin, she makes a clear comparison between a forest and a woman. And in the next stanza, Ao depicts the present condition of the forest which was once rich, full of luxury, losing splendor, it has become infertile now. How presents the devastation of the forest by comparing it to a helpless, molested girl, which is very poignant in her lines. How says, alas, for the forest which now lies silent, stunned and stumped with the evidence of her rape. Very importantly, how portrays how the forest has lost its charm after being raped by the modern civilization and modern practices called something called in the name of growth and development. The third person I would take up, of course, two female poets now, one male poet, Rabin S. Angam. And Rabin S. Angam's making is very important because Ravin and many Northeastern poets were part of, and they first published their works in Chandrabhaga, the journal Jayanta used to edit. And Ravin was very closely associated with Jayanta. So Ravin's poetry is much affected and also influenced and shaped by Jayanta Mahapatra's style of writing and strive of conceiving ideas and transforming them into poetry. Ravin S. Angam is an important name from the northeastern region these days, and he has been writing for a long time, and also being a professor of English, he knew how to articulate and transform his idioms into poetic idiom. Rabin S. Angam's poems from his celebrated collection, Words and the Silence. And the Words of this and the Silence was published in 1988. Another very important volume that we can talk of Rabin S. Angam, Times Crossroads. And the Times Crossroads was published in 1994. And in 2006, Rabin came out with another important book, which are also part of, we can think of eco poetics, that is the desire of roots. And the desire of root searches for Rabin's own roots in his own community. And that is very important. Rabin, Maman, as like Tamshulav, all are the map makers of contemporary Indian English poetry, and they give a new entity to Indian English poetry. That Indian English poetry is not only written from the mainstream world, but also written from the Northeast powerfully, subtly, and this poetry is, of course, this gamut of poetry is aesthetically satisfying. Let me introduce in front of you an important poem by Ravinus Angam. The title is magical. The dead shall mourn the living. The dead shall mourn the living. The dead shall mourn the living, never knowing who is better off, mutually shaking their heads in shadow pity. The dead shall mourn the living, never knowing who is better off, mutually shaking their heads in shadow pity. Ravinus Angam's Times Crossroads, published in 1994, is a kind of book that talks about his association with the landscape over there and his integrated rootedness in his community. Very precisely speaking, the Northeastern poets are very unique to our Indian English poetry. They actually refer to the politics of the region very poignantly and very differently. And when we read of Northeastern poetry, and mainly Mamang, Temsula, or Rabin, we have a very different kind of discourse that engages. There is that discourse is a very aesthetically rich, and this poetry is very powerful, politically charged, as well as charged with the regional flavor and rootedness, because most of us who think that who teach in different universities, colleges across India, in syllabus we see there are hardly any course of the Northeastern history, political politics of the Northeast, which are not been studied so much at the school level, college level, in Indian classrooms. But when it comes to the Northeastern poetry, Northeastern writings, unless knowing the cultural nuances, knowing the oral tradition, knowing the folk tradition over there, without knowing their history, politics of the region, is very difficult to digest and, of course, assimilate their poetry properly. But my proposition here is in this morning is that eco poetry is one of the very important dimensions to look at contemporary Indian English poetry, which I think the Himalayas of the world now, because contemporary Indian English poetry is a brand, is a trend setter. That's why many reputed scholars who are practicing poets and the scholars and poetry, and they are guest editing special issues for poetry and collaborations in the leading journals of the world, which gives an insight that how Indian English poets are respected globally now. And because Indian can use and write anything and everything through an amazing meter and amazing free verse, and with the help of images, myths, and the legends which are rooted in India, which are cannot be comparable, which are absent in world scenario, because the countries like India, Egypt, Greece, Rome are rich with mythologies. If one thing we can talk about in India is its plurality, its multicultural dimensions, multilingual perspectives. Monoculture can bore us, and their monocultural writers who are product of monoculture can never write a novel or a poem that the Indians can ever write of, because India and one poet is a summation of different thought processes. One poet is a multi-dimensional, because of his and her engagement with the world, the land, and its people. So India, the poets we took up in this morning are representative of a big chunk of poets. There's a solid number of poets who are really mesmerizing the world and who are showing directions to the world how to write poetry aesthetically, powerfully, politically, as well as keeping in mind all the important facets of writing poetry, where poetry writing is an engagement and, of course, is a soul making process. And when it comes to eco poetry, the writers from the Northeast, the poets from the Northeast are very important. We know several poets from the Northeastern region. Apart from these three poets, they have been writing incessantly, and of course, writing and moving us through their art of poetry, their art of articulation. So today I tried to give an overview of how eco poetry came out of the term, and how eco poetry is related to lives matter, where living is very important, living of human being in the context of ecology and our other living things may it be animals, may it be living world like trees and other things, how one is dependent on others, and how poetry is not silent in portraying or actually be giving a pain picture of how lives matter. Lives are very important, and that have been presented through eco poetry. And uh, one of the storehouse, or I'll say one of the reservoirs is, of course, northeastern part of India. And even so, three samples are here, but they're all writers who have been engaged, poetry, who are writing from the northeastern region, are very important soul makers of eco poetry poetics. Thank you so much, and over to Priyanka Madam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. That was really vibrant, and the most important thing, as I noticed, is northeast, where there is so much ecological diversity, and that has been reflected in the writings, in the composition of the poets as well. And Mamundai, Pensulaya, and Robin Nangam. I'm sorry for the pronunciation. Yes.
Ravines Angam. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I understand. No problem.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for such a wonderful presentation. We are just moving on to our next speaker. Uh, it's Dr. Ajanta Paul.
Just hold on, Priyanka. I think Professor Jaydeep Sarangi would like to leave in the middle of the lecture, isn't it?
Yes, I have a viva for PhD, so
Yes,
I'll have
yes.
to
So
leave. So
before,
can I have questions, please? Yeah, sure.
of course, of course. So, Prof, so before he leaves, I would like to make a couple of comments so that he leaves. Then we move on to Professor Ajanta. Is it okay, Priyanka?
Sure, sure.
Fine, fine. So, okay, Professor Jaydeep Sarangi, it was a very, very well researched presentation, no doubt. And yes, nothing less is expected from you. So you did what I was expecting from you. So from your lecture, I have taken a few points which I would like to use, in the syllabus that we would be designing for comparative world literature department, MA and BA programs. That the points that I have taken and I have thought about those during your lecture, I would like to just point out. You talked about lives matter in eco poetry, which is a very timely and very important subject today. Priyanka would agree with me. She is an environmentalist. She works on green cultural studies and history and all of that. So I am sure that she could connect well with your presentation. And your focus was Northeast poetry. Yes, that is important. I have introduced Northeast poetry, especially the poetry of Momong Dai and Temsula Ao in our MA in folk literature in IGNO that we have designed and launched. MAFCS I have introduced there. And in Hindi University as well, we would be introducing at least one block on Northeast poetry where we would take your help, your suggestions, including poets like Mamongdai, Tamshula Ayo, and Ravi Nesangam, and all of them. And also, you focused a little bit on international poetry. We would make comparative studies of Northeast poetry with some international poets and then take it further. And then you mentioned poetry as a living force and a living ecosystem with empathy, with harmony and coexistence. And then, very important and a pertinent point that you told was violence against Mother Earth and how poetry is a cultural model to talk about those things, to problematize the violence against Mother Earth, and then how poetry can also give solutions. Poets are not just word jugglers, they can talk about social issues, cultural, and all those important issues, and then they can also give some solutions. And the courses that we propose on comparative or literature departments, they can talk about eco poetry at least in one block in every course, where we would discuss about environmental justice, indigenous wisdom, interconnectedness of the human and non-human lives. That's what I have taken from your today's lecture. And then also we can mention the colonial and capitalist exploitations, like many eco poets, the three that you mentioned, and many more I know and you know. They critique industrialization, deforestation, new colonial land grabs. They also talk about the displacement of tribal and the marginalized communities, and how poetry, both human and ecological, can talk about those issues. So we have taken that. And then another important point that you made is the voices of the marginalized, like the Adivasis, Dalits, and the farmers. They suffer due to environmental degradation, and how environmental destruction is entangled with caste and class oppression. This is something that I have taken my takeaway today from your lecture, is something like this. And somewhere you briefly mentioned about the loss of biodiversity as a cultural loss. Yes, many Indian poets, they mourn the destruction of the flora and the fauna as an erasure of the cultural memory and the traditional knowledge systems, and they recognize that the death of a tree or a river, you know, and when it comes to Mamang Dai, definitely river poems are there. So the death of a tree or a river is also the death of some stories, some songs, and some way of life. I have taken that from you. And then eco-feminist perspectives are something that are coming up in a big way, and definitely we are going to take those things as a part of our syllabus. Then another thing that I could visualize from your lecture today is the sacred geographies and the spirituality in Indian eco poetry, which often invokes sacred rivers like the Ganga, the Yamuna, the Narmada, and the poetry shows how the pollution and the depletion of the rivers signify a spiritual and existential crisis for communities that depend on them. So this is one thing that we would take further. Then you somewhere mentioned about the climate change and the disaster narratives, how the poets engage with contemporary issues like flood, displacement due to climate change, and migration and all of that. And then resistance and activism, poets are activists. Yes, I do agree with you. Many eco poets, they talk about Chipko movement, Narmada Bachao Andolan, and so many things are coming up in eco poetry. And then somewhere you mentioned about urbanization and alienation from nature. And then finally, language as ecological witness. The language of poetry is the language of ecological witness, like folk idioms, regional languages, and a lot of these things come in the poetry which you have mentioned. I have taken these points from your lecture. We would be massively using all of them in our syllabus of the MA programs, the BA programs. Thank you very much for taking out these important points, for engaging our students and our scholars and teachers with these important points. We will certainly get back to you. Thanks a lot once again. And now, Priyanka, please.
Thank you so much, and really wonderful. Yeah, a very perceptive appreciation that you give. Another thing is actually whenever we think of now, we have a general tendency of framing the course itself, but history of the place, the politics of the place, a kind of component to that that will benefit reading the contextualizing the writers, because many poets, many students will be reading the poems without visiting the place. So, like when we were students, we studied English literature as well as English cultural history, history of England. No. So similar thing, the history of the Northeast as a component, which will give an inroad to their future cultural studies. Thank you so much for all this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So you are leaving now?
I can take one or two questions, then I leave.
Oh, sure, sure. Any questions, Priyanka? And also, Professor Sarangi, please don't worry. We are recording everything. We will share the YouTube with you so that you don't miss out on lecture
I
agenda.
won't miss out. I'll join from another mobile. So please,
Okay.
I'll take
Otherwise,
that.
also, we will share the
Sure.
YouTube.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah. Any question, please?
Any question?
Sir, actually, we are actually I'm from history background. My specialization is on environmental history. So we actually work on eco criticism and eco criticality and ecotourism. So all these things imbibe not they don't imbibe poetry as such, and we actually try to point out on the things that ecology can be a source of heritage, can be a source of can be a spot of uh, uh, can be a spot for the people to visit. So all these things, do you know that all these things are being reflected in their poetry, or there are any other poetry that reflects on these things? Because there are many places which are not being visited by people. They are not so popular. So we try to reflect on that. So all these things are being reflected in the poetry as well. This is just
Yes,
my.
some poems, but I especially remember Malasavi Jacob. Malasavi Jacob is the first Mizo novelist, and her novel Zorami, Zorami. Zorami means flower in Mizo. And Zorami happens to be the first English novel by a Mizo writer. And Malasavi Jacob, this is a political novel. What I tried to say is that this is a political history of the Mizo, and in the context of Nepal and everything, the political dimensions we know about, or we about the place. But her poetry, I'm talking about her poetry as well as rich with several destinations, which can be tourist paradise as well. Very important, that is a question that you have made. So we can use to eco poetry as prelude to ecotourism as well, and we can use some of them in our as cultural passage to that place. And some talk about the food habit over there. Mm. I know there is a T. Kedisco. T. Kedisco is a very young, promising poet is coming from Nagaland, and Thimphu. And she writes about the habits of the people over there and their weaving, their special way of weaving things. And she writes about their habit of taking tea in the early morning, and their cultural nuances are reflected through her poetry. Very powerfully, T. Kediscu writes these days. There are so many, and each one, no, when there is a general tendency to call Northeast as Northeast, but within Northeast, we should not forget how diverse, unified, diverse, but a kind of cultural plural space, and but we are talking it commonly and giving a name the Northeast. The Northeast is a big space and which is very vibrant, exotic, as well as mind blowing. And it can, hypnotize you. It can charm through its culture, through its language, through its habits of living, history, and of course, unique and exotic the vibrancy over there. Yes, thank you.
Yes, sir, that's true. Because if we don't know the culture of the place, if we don't know the place, then this that place will remain remote forever. So
Absolutely. Therefore, even in literary courses, there should be some one component of the history of the place. Suppose someone is writing from Paradip or the Odisha, and
yes,
unless you know the cult of Odisha, it's very difficult to appreciate a poem on Puri, a poem on Chandrabhaga, a poem on maybe on Konarak. Very difficult to understand. So that component can be, there.
yes, so very true. Thank you so much, sir. Sir, what?
Thank you so much. And Ajanta, I'll listen to you. About going. Thank you. And thank you,
Okay,
Honorable Vice
Jaydeep.
Chancellor, Madam. Thank you. We
Sure,
connect
sure,
each other.
sure. So
We'll
wish you
get
a
back to
good
you.
have a good day. We will get in touch with you
Thank
very
you
soon.
so much. Thank you.
So we are moving to our next speaker. Dr. Ajanta Paul is a widely published poet, short story writer, and literary critic. She's currently principal at Women's Christian College, Kolkata, India. A Pushkat nominee, Ajanta has been published in literary journals, including Spadina Literary Review, the Pangolin Review, of course, the Statesman, the Bombay Review, the Wild Ward, Anticus Review, Shetu, Kitab, the Punch Magazine, the Critical Flame, Kavya Varati, International Journal of Multicultural Literature, Writers, Editors, Critics, the Chakkar and Lotharian Poetry Journal. Extremely sorry for the pronunciation. Actually, we are not used to this literary journal. So, Ajanta's publications include a book of poetic plays, The Journey Eternal, Silesian College Publications, Shiliguri, 2013, a collection of short stories, The Elixir Maker and Other Stories, Author Press, New Delhi, 2018, a book of literary criticism, American poetry, colonial to contemporary, Avenue Press, Kolkata, 2021, a book of poems from the Singing Bowl of the Soul, 50 poems, Shetu, Pittsburgh, December 2023, and her latest collection of poems, Beached Driftwood, Hawkal Publishers, New Delhi, December 2023, and a collection of eco-critical poems, Art Elegies, Pen Prints, Kolkata 2024, published and launched at the Kolkata International Book Fair 2024. Dr. Paul's academic books, Modern British Short Stories, Critical Interpretations, 2008, American Poetry, Colonial to Contemporary, 2021, and a revision of Milton's Paradise Lost, Book 1 and 2, 2010, are popular reference books for scholars of English. Thank you, ma'am, for giving us some time. Thank you. Over to Ajanta.
Thank you, Dr. Guharoy, and very warm thanks to Professor Nandini Sahu, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Hindi University, West Bengal, for having extended this very warm invitation to me. I feel it is a singular honor and a great privilege to be present at this platform and to share my views with all of you. Professor Jaydeep Sarangi is not only a friend and a colleague, he's like a younger brother to me. We have been together on many things, various projects, and he is an unfailing supporter and a source of great help at all times. So it's wonderful to be in such good, pleasant, august company for one's intellectual deliberations. Now, since the larger series is on comparative world literatures, I have chosen two texts from two traditions which are quite different from each other. One is uh, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and the other text, equally seminal, is Chinua Achebe, Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart, which is actually part of a trilogy. So, the overarching theme for this online lecture, being comparative world literatures, I shall engage in a reading of two texts chosen from global literary traditions belonging to widely disparate time frames and cultural movers, attempting to show how a particular theme, in this case it is colonialism, resounds in distinct literary canons, which, while qualifying as world literature, are intrinsically different in their national and racial orientation and socio-cultural ethos. Now, I would like to just spend a few moments trying to explain the topic world literature. I'm sure it is clear by now because you all have already had dozen speakers on this topic, either tangentially or um, otherwise directly connecting with world literature. But I still feel that maybe I should offer a few words on this topic. The term world literature necessarily refers to literary works that have gained significant recognition and circulation beyond their country of origin, whatever that country is, often due to their universal themes and artistic merit, causing them to transcend national boundaries. Now, what traditionally may be examples of world literature? I should think the epical canon in different national traditions, classical texts, path-breaking works, or any literature that is universally resonant. dealing with human experiences like love, loss, power, identity, and justice, allowing readers from different cultures to connect with the story. So all these texts may be considered to be examples of world literature. World literature is also that which is widely translated, distributed, and accessible to readers in multiple languages, enabling a global reach. Examples of world literature must not only enjoy a high literary and artistic quality, but should reflect important contemporary social, political, and cultural discourses and be able to engage with multiple multivalent contexts, often igniting dialogue and critical interaction across space and time. Now, the two texts that I have chosen for my purpose, as I have already mentioned, are uh, both hyperconnotative and super seminal. These are Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And I would like to engage with their respective portrayals of colonialism. In the past, world literature primarily referred to the masterpieces of the Western European canon. But with the passage of time and the subsequent dismantling of the hegemonic ideological apparatus, however, the term enjoys a more inclusive range of reference, accommodating the literatures of the entire globe in its reach. Now, while Conrad's novel shows an already entrenched imperialism working its exploitative evils in the interiors of the Congo, Achebe's novel start, charts the early infiltration of the so-called white man's influence in the hinterlands of Nigeria. In Heart of Darkness, the narrator, that is the European uh, speaker Malo, undertakes a voyage up the river, that is the river Congo, towards its source, exploring in the process the horrific and dehumanizing effects of European colonialism on the Congolese, the natives of the Congo. In Things Fall Apart, the protagonist, Okonkwo, traces a journey to exile and back without acquiring any self knowledge and undergoes a gratuitous and what is to the clan a contemptible death. Now, analyzed from a post structuralist theoretical perspective, the non binary and anti essentialist aspects of the discourse in both novels have been largely overlooked by commentators who have tended to examine the colonial encounter as a simplistic struggle between colonizer and colonized, between racial white and black, and the socio-economically empowered and disempowered. So what I mean to say or suggest is that the nuances have been entirely tossed out, and it is seen to be, you know, a very cut and dried kind of an exploration, and shown in very simplistic terms. And I intend to undertake a post-structuralist reading of the phenomenon of colonialism, as shown in these two novels. Now, the racial societies depicted in both texts are informed with subtle tension, which militate against both self and other, and which challenge a straightforward reading of the situations implied. Joseph Conrad, a Polish British writer, subsuming dual racial identities in his ontological and aesthetic orientation, and using English possibly as a fourth language, after Polish, French, and Russian, is seen as both as an imperialist and an anti-imperialist. This apparent contradiction lies at the heart of Conrad's work, such as Heart of Darkness, published in 1899, unsettling any notions of a rigid dichotomy of attitudes. Edward Said's analysis in Culture and Imperialism highlights the dual nature of Conrad's stance towards imperialism which not only complicates his response to this particular ideology, but challenges a logical assessment of his motivations and beliefs. Incidentally, my other author, Sinuachidi, had delivered a very powerful talk in the year 1975 in which he had called out Conrad for being a thoroughgoing racist. And he had articulated this opinion that he tended to see the Congolese as less than human and he was extremely racist in his attitude. So we find that in this novel, imperialism is exposed for what it is and in certain ways tolerated despite its perceived flaws. Even as Conrad deplores imperialism and its attendant evils, he accepts the justification for it, perceiving the need for European colonizers to civilize what he calls, I quote, the barbaric peoples of Africa. Africans are shown by him in an extremely negative light as primitive and savage, even bestial. This is probably because he is unable to dispense with the attitudinal frameworks which are part of a European subject's psychological conditioning, even as he is aware of the inhumanity of the colonizing worldview, thus yielding to an ironic intermingling of shades in his moral spectrum that challenges the monochromatic disposition of a unilateral approach. Jacques Derrida and Homi K. Bhabha target not so much the mechanics of colonial exploitation in Algeria or India, respectively, as the structure of the Western episteme, which positions the European subject at the center and subordinates all other cultures to it. So it is the post colonial center margin theory which comes into play here to a certain extent. In Heart of Darkness by Conrad, it is Marlowe, the European narrator, through whose voice the action is mediated, who forms a kind of a center of consciousness, as it were. And in Things Fall Apart, the Okonkwo saga, the great warrior hero Okonkwo, his saga, for all its heroism and tragedy, would ironically merit merely a couple of paragraphs in the district collector's ambitious academic project, the pacification of the primitive tribes of the lower Niger. So, in the very title of the district collector's proposed book, we catch the inflections of irony. So, what was a great chapter in the African saga is being reduced to a mere footnote in his novel. The African characters in Conrad's novel are largely nameless and voiceless, representing, within quotes, the other in the narrative, highlighting the way colonialism constructs and marginalizes different cultures. Now, if you look at Achibe's novel, Things Fall Apart, and we concentrate on the native society, which was called Igbo society, and particularly look at the people of the village Umuofia, to which Okonkwo, the protagonist, belonged, we realize that they are divided in their attitude to colonialism. Some accept it gradually as an inevitable aspect of their faith, and some others accept it out of practical economic considerations, while some of them resist the phenomenon as may be expected. Thus, my point is that it is not a monolithic but a multifarious response to British colonialism that characterizes the attitude of the African people and encourages a post-structuralist reading of text. Now I quote from Things Fall Apart, the title of which novel has been taken, as many of us know, from Yeats's poem, Things Fall Apart, the center cannot hold, near anarchy is loosed on the world, the second coming. So I quote a couple of sentences from the novel. And at last the locusts did descend. They settled on every tree and on every blade of grass. They settled on the roofs and covered the bare ground. Unquote. While the quote is a symbolic representation, It accurately reflects the arrival of the intruders, that is, the white colonizers, who had every intention to take over the Igbo by introducing monotheistic religion, that is Christianity, and undermining the systems, the values that they had cherished all this while. Now, post structuralism questions the stability of knowledge, emphasizing its uncertainty and its changes according to culture, politics, and social position, rejecting the idea that there are fixed structures that govern the world. In Things Fall Apart, the old political dispensation of tribal democracy is gradually eroded with the arrival of the British colonizer and his centralized mode of power distribution. The social, cultural, and economic norms of pre colonized Nigeria, seen in part one of the novel, under threat of disruption from colonial intervention, demonstrates the instability of an entrenched order in the face of an imperial force. Because superficially, Igbo society would appear to be very stable, very settled, and very resistant to change. But here we find that the moment it comes into contact with an imperial force, there are subtle changes which are informing its being. In his study of prisons, discipline, and punish, Michel Foucault maintains that the relationship between power and knowledge is reciprocal. I quote Foucault here: power and knowledge imply one another, that there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. Unquote. Thereby affirming the interrelationality between two categories that mutually transmute into each other in the interchangeability of their basic character. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault speaks of three types of power, namely disciplinary power, biopower, and sovereign power. The exercise of these three types of power is found in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Disciplinary power and biopower are exercised by several subject positions within the discursive field portrayed in the novella, drawing upon knowledge considered as true within the historical period in question. Sovereign power comes into play as well, the exercise of which rejects such knowledge. So basically, these are types of power which come into contestation with the production of truth. What is truth ultimately? The inevitable question confronted by all of us. And the focal point of these power relations and their resulting statements is the trading agent, Kurtz, who is a kind of icon of depravity, what European colonialism has done to the world. A post-structuralist reading necessarily critiques binary opposition, highlighting the complexities and contradictions within Igbo society, particularly in relation to the arrival of British colonialism, thereby challenging the idea of a single, unified interpretation of the culture and also the protagonist, Okonkwo's character. Essentially, the novel, Things Fall Apart, that is, deconstructs the simplistic narrative of quote unquote traditional African society versus quote modern Western civilization by revealing the internal conflicts and power dynamics within the Igbo community itself. Achebe shows numerous praiseworthy practices within tribal society. He was himself a titled Igbo chief, such as love of the art of conversation, exemplified by Okonkwo's father Uloka's social interaction, the storytelling mode of education. The oral discourse was very important to Igbo culture, and political egalitarianism, which compare favorably with some of the so-called evolved beliefs of Europe. When the Western colonizers first arrived in Nigeria, they wanted to meet the king, and then they were told that there was no quote unquote king, but there were tribal chiefs, and power was, shared between them. Post-structuralism also examines how knowledge systems and power limit human thought and action. The native Nigerian epistemological apparatus was obviously not strong enough to withstand the intellectual incursions of colonizers and missionaries, who were able to exploit the weaknesses inherent in the local system. Blind adherence to tribal rules and customs and an uncritical reliance on superstitions prevented the Igbo people from developing new thought or contending effectively with onslaught on their way of life. Post structuralism develops new ways of thinking about identity and difference. In Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the central theme of an identity crisis is explored through the character of Marlowe, the European narrator, who undergoes a profound interrogation of his own morality and sense of civilization as he journeys deep into the Congo, exposing the brutality of colonialism and confronting the dark side of human nature, particularly embodied in the character of Kurtz. Essentially, Marlowe's perception of his own identity is challenged as he witnesses the erosion of civilized values in the face of the savagery of the colonial environment. As Marlowe ventures further into the African wilderness, he is forced to confront his own capacity for violence and exploitation, questioning the very foundation of his self image as, I quote, a civilized European. At the end of the novel, his understanding of his identity is perhaps vaguer than it had been at the beginning. So we see that there is no linear progression in self awareness, but rather a fraught post structuralist uncertainty that fails to hinge on a substantial truth. Edward Said's post colonial interpretation of self and other is seen to good effect in the outsider imagery of Conrad's novel. While the African is undeniably an other to the Europeans, even as he perceives the latter along the same line, Kurtz, in his grotesque greed and depraved decadence, is the ultimate other, even as Marlowe detects shades of an alien being in the recesses of his own self. Thus, the other in both the texts is not merely a mechanical and homogeneous binary to self, but a calibrated category that is integrally fraught and fluctuates in application. Now, in Akibe's novel, Things Fall Apart, the Africans and Europeans are mutually otherized in the polarity of their respective outcomes. From his outsider status, the white man attempts to destabilize the balance in the local clans, turning brother against brother. Now, the white man begins from a privileged Eurocentric position. He is at the center of things. Everything else is the end of the world. So, from a privileged Eurocentric position in world dynamics, the white man initially assumes an outsider role in Igbo society, ingratiating himself into the affections of the natives before taking over its core. Now, how did he kind of wriggle into the affections of the local people? He built his church on unhallowed land granted by the local chiefs, the so called evil forest, and took into its fold, that is the fold of the church, the outcast, or I quote, Ozu of Igbo society. Margins, thresholds, and centers are seen to be not fixed entities, but tremulous limits or limbs, shifting according to larger convulsions of alignments. So, from his church in the evil forest, a boundary overlaid with cultural and psychosocial balances of ostracism, the European colonizer moved slowly but surely to the center of power. Now, what is this power? What is this center of power? According to Derrida, I quote, the center, which is by definition unique, constituted that very thing within a structure, which while governing the structure escapes structurality. Unquote. This quality of the center being in and not of the structure is an intriguing theoretical aspect believed in by Derrida and applied by him to explain the formal immunity of the controlling colonizers to any metaphysics of containment. Okonkwo's close friend Obierica, who is also a choral character in the novel, observes, I quote, the white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion. We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one. He has put a knife on the things that held us together, and we have fallen apart. Unquote. It is precisely the structural integrity of the African people as a race that is threatened by a kind of imperialism that, by virtue of being at the center, controls its constituent elements without in any way conforming to the structure or being tasked with the accountability that it should ideally enjoin on its executors. The destruction or the deconstruction of binary oppositions in Things Fall Apart reinforces the post-structuralist nature of the work. There is the masculinity versus femininity debate, for instance. Okonkwo's extreme masculinity is shown in reaction to his father Inoka's perceived weakness, highlighting the social and semiotic tensions within the concept of manliness. Okonkwo's violence and rigid inflexibility detract from a true ideal of manliness, which is provided as a submerged discourse in the text through numerous examples, including the story about the old clansman, Endule, who loved, respected, and followed his wife, even as he was himself a deeply respected warrior and leader. With regard to tradition versus change, one sees that while the novel Things Fall Apart initially presents the Igbo culture as stable, the arrival of colonialism exposes the cracks within the system, as something I mentioned earlier, challenging the notion of a pure, unchanging tradition. Similarly, with individual versus community, Okonkwo's Okonkwo's desire for personal recognition often conflicts with the needs of his community, demonstrating the complex interplay between individual aspirations and social expectations. There is also the notion of the unreliable narrator. In both instances, the racial encounter has been memorably evoked. In Heart of Darkness, it is the European assessment of the Africans, while in Things Fall Apart, it is the Africans who recount their experiences with the colonizers. In the latter novel, although the story is told from the uh, protagonist Okonkwo's point of view, the third person narration leaves room for manipulation of effects and responses, thereby tempering the reader's understanding of his character, intentions, and fate. In the comparable text, Marlowe's narration too is not considered a reliable source of truth, as his perspective is often influenced by his biases and experiences, leading to multiple interpretations of events and characters. Both novels utilize big symbolism, like the imagery of the quote unquote evil forest in Things Fall Apart, to represent the complexities of the Igbo belief system and also the potential for misinterpretation. And in Heart of Darkness, we have the imagery of darkness, the river, the figure of Kurtz, which hold many the prose reinforces colonial power dynamics, including the way Africans are often dehumanized through language. So finally, I conclude two specimens of world literature, one narrated by a European and the other presented by an African, entangling with a common theme, that of colonialism, and exploring the same in disparate settings and from different perspectives. When juxtaposed and examined through the lens of a post-structuralist reading, yields what I hope are interesting convergences of situation, response, and attitude, along with the inevitable divergences that are naturally expected to attend the two traditions, international in scope, but deeply rooted in their respective realities. Thank you. I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Ajanta. Priyanka, before you take over for inviting questions from people, may I give a couple of comments?
Sure.
Sure, okay.
Looking forward to it.
Sure. So, Professor Ajanta Paul, I was listening to you rather carefully, and I have taken up quite a few issues here, and I have taken down some important points here, so that we can use those points in the syllabus of the MA programs in comparative world literatures. And please correct me if I have taken anything wrong, or please add if I have left anything important. So today you talked about Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. You have compared, very rightly, you have compared a Polish British writer with an African writer, and you have taken some very common threads between both the writers, like you have taken colonial themes. And in almost all the BA and MA programs, uh, willingly or unwillingly, we have to talk about colonialism and post-colonialism. So you have rightly taken that theme. And then you mentioned some national and racial connotations in the writings of both of them. And then you theorized them with Edward Said, with Bhumike Bhava, and whatnot. You have taken quite a few theoretical frameworks, theoretical tools, and also the experts, the theorists who have done a lot of interesting and important work on comparative literatures. And then my takeaway today is the non-binary perspectives that you repeatedly mentioned in the writings of both of them, like the power structure. You also talked about the human psychology, and then post-structuralism and how that can be the backdrop in some research and the courses, academic programs vis-a-vis comparative world literatures. So my takeaway are actually many. I have taken down so many points. I'll just mention a couple of them. One is colonialism and its psychological impact. That can be a part of the academic programs that we give our students, like Heart of Darkness, how it explores the psychological disintegration of European colonizers, particularly through Kuz, and then he embodies the madness induced by the unchecked material and imperial power. Whereas Things Fall Apart, in contrast, it focuses on how colonization disrupts indigenous communities, portraying the tragic downfall of the Igbo community and their resistance that you talked about. And then another point that we may mention in our research vis-a-vis comparative world literatures, when we take Polish British writers and African writers, probably we can talk about the representation of Africa and the Africans in the contemporary world literatures. Like we can also take racial and national connotations in Joseph Conrad's novel through the critical issues related to the European greed, and the views of Africa through the exercised racialized gazes. How Chinua Achebe, he claims that African perspectives are written in many contemporary literary texts. He mentions all those things, and you somehow pointed out on those. And the non-binary perspectives on colonization. This is something very interesting. I would recommend that the teachers of the department and also the students, they take this very seriously, and in their research they should incorporate the non-binary perspectives. And here you talked about non-binary perspectives on colonization in both the texts. And then you mentioned about the power structures, how European literature versus the indigenous governance. And Joseph Conrad, he presents a corrupt, exploitative European power structure that thrives on extraction and violence, and how Chinua Achebe, he depicts an already complex Igbo socio-political system that is decentralized, democratic, and it is based on customs, contrasting it with the rigid and the hierarchical colonial administration. How beautifully you have quoted from the texts, and then you have tried to incorporate both the texts by maintaining a balance between their points of view, their engagements, and then you have definitely theorized in the most apt and most logical manner. Somehow I understood the gender and body politics that you hinted at. Women in Heart of Darkness are largely absent or they're reduced to symbols, but in Things Fall Apart, the characters are centered on a hyper masculine protagonist. They're presented as hyper masculine protagonists, and they also talk about the Igbo gender dynamics. And then in both the texts, how moral ambiguity versus cultural clarity, that was one issue that you took up. And then language as a colonial and anti-colonial tool. The language of both the texts, they can be used as tools for colonial and anti-colonial narratives. You have hinted at both of them. So probably one of the blocks can talk about the issues of the language, where we can take up these issues, and we'll definitely get in touch with you to help us more with your expertise and your research that you have actually helped IGNOU. We would like you to help in the university as well. And then somewhere you mentioned the collapse of the individual versus the collective identity. How the individual identity and the collective identity, they are set as two dichotomies in both the narratives. And then finally, when you mentioned about the narrative structures and the perspectives of both the texts, it was something very interesting, and I'm going to read more about those. So, my takeaway from your paper, your research was, while Heart of Darkness critiques European imperialism from within, it remains trapped in a colonial mindset. Things Fall Apart reverses the gaze, asserting Africa's historical and cultural legitimacy. Together, both the texts they form a dialectical conversation on colonialism, identity politics, and power in world literatures. You have very wisely and very carefully selected the texts, Professor Ajanta, so that you fit into the framework of comparative world literatures, and we are hugely benefited from your research and your expertise. We are going to continue this engagement with you. Thank you once again for accepting our invitation and giving this very powerful, very impactful and important research to us. Thanks. Priyanka, please.
Thank you, Professor Sahu. Thank you very much. I would just like to point out one thing. You mentioned about gender and femininity, feminism. I think that part of it was somewhat lacking in my paper. But if we look at Igbo society, it was very male dominated, very, very patriarchal. And yet there was a balance in the ways in which some of the men treated their women. And as I have mentioned, that there was a submerged discourse on masculinity and Okonkwo's hypermasculinity was frowned upon by many of the townsmen. His beating of the wives and his, refusal to show emotion at any cost. So these things were uh, uh, points which militated against Okonkwo. So we find that this actually has scope for further reading, exploration, and further research can be done. And actually was
Yes.
absolutely aghast at the way in which the Europeans tended to show the Africans. And he said he's one of the pioneering African voices. And he started work with the Heinemann series of great African writers. And while he was with the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation, while he was with that publishing house, he really tried to introduce, important African writers. Ngugi, for instance, Ngugi Wa Thiong'o had been introduced by Achebe to the world through the Heinemann publishers. So we find that he has a kind of a canon making contribution too, as far as literature goes. Thank you. Thank you so much for summing it up so beautifully and so comprehensively, Dr. Sahu. I'm
Thank-
really, really impressed and truly indebted to you.
Thanks.
So much.
Yeah,
Thank
Priyanka.
you.
Uh, is there any questions? I don't think there will be any question. But thank you so much for such a nice lecture. We are moving to our last section, that is a vote of thanks. So on behalf of Hindi University, I'd like to extend my thanks to both the speakers for their thought-provoking, vibrant, thought-provoking lecture. Most importantly, I'd like to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, ma'am, for organizing such wide-ranged lectures which enriched us to a great extent. I'd also like to thank our finance officer, sir, controller, sir, and registrar, sir, for extending their support. Special thanks should be given to Rajji, who managed to create the Zoom link and support the webinar with all the technical helps. Last but not the least, I'd like to thank all the students who have joined the webinar. Thank you all. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Priyanka.
And
Many congratulations to you. Thanks. Okay, Professor Ajanta, thank you and namaskar.